Hello, and welcome to this month's installment of Education System in Crisis. Today, we're going to talk about white backlash in education. Joining us today is Kwame Edwards. Kwame is a sociologist and aesthetic engineer who specializes in the Western African diaspora. Both his academic work and nonfiction films have been recognized and showcased both domestically and globally. He has been a faculty member at American University, across the University System of Maryland, and several community colleges. When Kwame is not working on advancing the narratives of the African diaspora, he's encouraging more Black people to increase and enhance their wellness by riding bikes and advocating for sustainable bike infrastructure in systemically underserved communities of color. Welcome, Kwame Edwards.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you joining us. You might be wondering, what is white backlash? We define it as the visceral response to any challenge to existing inequitable societal power structures made by marginalized people. Let's first talk about its history in this country. U.S. treaties were regularly violated and ignored. Native Americans were forcibly removed from their lands. The United States government subjected them to a series of forced displacements, aka Indian removal. It impacted approximately 100,000 Native Americans between 1830 and 1850. The infamous Trail of Tears was one of the first such removals. U.S. soldiers marched the Cherokee people at bayonet point, almost 1,000 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. Another infamous act occurred in December 1890. A Lakota encampment on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation was attacked by the U.S. Army, and close to 300 Native Americans were murdered near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. While whites scream about their Second Amendment rights, Wounded Knee occurred in an effort to disarm natives. These attacks continue today in one form or another. Black people weren't spared either. Kimberly Jones is an author and Black Lives Matter activist. Let's hear what her take is on white backlash.
Me this is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything, and then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground.
When Black people gain power, white people retaliate. From the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, white grievance took hold over Reconstruction shepherded in Black codes to reestablish white supremacy and control over Black bodies, followed by the birth of the KKK. Why? Because Black people were claiming agency over their bodies and destiny. Many Black people were elected to local, state, and federal political offices, controlling not just their destiny, but their peoples as well. The 1900s ushered in Red Summer, so named for all the blood spilled in a deadly series of white mobs massacring Black people in at least 26 cities, from Tulsa to DC, from 1917 through 1923. Why? Fear of Black men taking jobs from white people, or to quash prosperous Black communities, it was common for organized white backlash to use violence against Black freedom and agency over their destiny. On January 28, 1918, 15 Mexican Americans were killed by a group of Texas Rangers, U.S. Army cavalry soldiers, and local ranchers. The Rangers went door to door, ordering the inhabitants of the community out of their homes and marched unarmed men and boys to where they were executed. The remaining 140 residents fled Port Vanilla, and the U.S. Army razed the community. The white men were seeking revenge for a deadly attack at a nearby ranch a month earlier, although there was no evidence tying the community members to it. The perpetrators never faced criminal charges, but their actions are still felt 100 years later by the descendants of those who were killed. While it is one of the most documented atrocities of this period in Texas history, details of the massacre have been shrouded in mystery for decades. Many federal government documents about the killing were classified, and the state refused to publish transcripts of the investigations until the late 1970s. There was also mass deportations of Mexican Americans and immigrants during the Great Depression. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. This act was an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. For the first time, federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order in certain localities. The act also placed many restrictions on Chinese people who were already here. We will explore white backlash in education for students of color. Native children were stolen from their homes just to plunder more land from Native nations through Native American boarding schools. It was not about the acceptance of non-whites. The schools were established in the US during the 19th and mid-20th centuries. Let's hear from Daniel Nelson Fox.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving me.
Saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution: to absorb and assimilate them.
The purported stated goal was to kill the Indian and save the man. The effects of the Native boarding schools on our Native brothers and sisters were assimilation, not education, ethnic cleansing. Children were physically and sexually abused. Native children were stripped of their names, languages, customs, spiritual practices, just as was done with Black people. The program began in the early 20th century. There's a pattern of instilling inferiority in non-white children. The prevailing theme, again, was most children of Mexican descent don't speak English, don't have proper health habits, and need training in morals, manners, and cleanliness. Wow. Irony, right? One El Medina, California school board member lamented, if we educate the Mexicans better, who will pick our crops? All about getting more free and cheap labor brought to you by who? The pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, people. U.S. continually established separate and unequal school systems for students of color. However, our money funded both, although we didn't receive the benefit of both. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark 1954 Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court unanimously found that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Many school systems closed rather than integrate. Gwinnett Schools was one of those systems that closed rather than integrate their schools. In South Carolina, Black children attended schools without running water, flush toilets, or electricity. In one county, $149 was spent per year on each white student, but only $43 on each Black student. In Delaware, Black students attended poorly equipped one-room schoolhouse, while a well-equipped white school existed nearby. In Virginia, a Black high school at the center of the case was overcrowded and was without a cafeteria or gym. The same was not true at the local white school. This is how students were greeted. In 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was the first Black child to desegregate a Louisiana school. Ruby's school district created entrance exams for Black students. These exams determined whether Black students could compete academically at an all-white school. Ruby and 5 other students passed the test. In 1972, several metro area school systems, including Gwinnett, were sued. The suit alleged that segregation in the region's housing market and public schools was the result of intentionally discriminatory practices aimed at containing Black residential growth to Atlanta and its immediate area, while expanding white residential growth in outlying suburbs. To remedy the situation, the plaintiffs sought a metropolitan-wide desegregation order. In one motion, Gwinnett's lawyers acknowledged that the district disproportionately classified Black students as retarded. And nearly 50 years later, after the ACLU found that Gwinnett didn't identify a single Black child as gifted, access to opportunity is still a problem. One of the Gwinnett School Board members, Mary Kay Murphy, her response to Education Week when they showed her the data on the disparity in identification and access, who would say they're to be equal? Let's learn more.
With AP and gifted placement, those same type of kids are the same types of kids that are going to want to invest in school and the clubs and all that. And that's because the teachers encourage it. I've always been one of those kids. I was like in the AP gifted higher up programs. And you see like the same sort of like 30 to 50 kids in all your classes. And the main reason this discrepancy stuck out to me is because I have a lot of friends that aren't in those classes. I knew plenty of people who were smart enough to be in some of those classes. And I would say that one of the problems is sometimes teachers don't always recommend certain students up to higher levels, or there may be a slight bias against recommending certain students. Grayson started to become more diverse and African American. The dynamics and demographics of the higher classes still didn't change.
Students with disabilities were, of course, excluded from a proper education. It took many years of advocacy and the passage of laws for these students to gain the right to a free and appropriate education. Let's peel back a layer on special education and gifted enrollment. Black students continue to be underrepresented in academic opportunities, overrepresented in discipline. But racism seems to be awash. We have the slavery math questions, where students in elementary schools were subjected to questions around math about how long it would take for slaves to pick certain crops. At Archer High School, the principal announced he would have students suspended for wanting to hold an anti-racist rally there wearing all Black. There are so many instances of the racism that occurs in Gwinnett County School. I encourage you, Google Gwinnett schools and race or racism, and you will get a whole plethora of links. ICE, the immigration enforcement that thankfully Gwinnett is no longer a part of, but they conducted early morning raids of Gwinnett students' homes in the Meadow Creek club community. They came around at like 4 a.m. to raid students' homes. That really disrupted the community. There have been several high-profile cases of sexual assaults of students as well. You can Google that too. James Alvin Wilbanks stated that special education is an albatross around the neck of public education. What's just as interesting is the cleanup attempt by Bernie Kirkland. She explained the superintendent was not complaining outright about special education, but he becomes impatient with those who want more than what is determined by our professionals as fair. As if families and students don't have a right or a consideration in that. You take what we give you or you go on. We know Black students are suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. Black students are arrested more and are referred to law enforcement more. The disparities in punishment even reach to Black students with disabilities, who are more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension or to be subjected to mechanical restraints than their white peers. Change is a-coming. The community mounted a push to move Louise Radloff out after 47 years. You heard that, 47 years of sitting on the school board. Since there wasn't a Republican challenger for the July primary, the winner would prevail. Gwinnett elected its first Black woman, Dr. Therese Johnson. The election wasn't even close. We were hungry for change. The response? You guessed it, white backlash. The Gwinnett white community put out a lot of propaganda about Dr. Therese to delegitimize her character and her win. Their gaslight campaign was up fiercely running. They also funded a write-in challenger and spent several $1,000s on his race. As you can see too, the other board members aligned themselves with the other white candidates, aligned themselves with Mr. Pusar. This is the effect. Mr. Pusar received 0.76% of the vote. Let me say that again. That's less than 1%. 0.76% of the vote. All of that hate spread through the community for 0.76% of the vote. Totally unnecessary. You could have just run, but all of the hate directed at the Black female candidates should not have been spread through a community that is majority people of color. Hate doesn't win. Now we have two. So now we have two more people of color. Gwinnett reaffirmed the election of Dr. Therese and elected Mrs. Karen Watkins too. We needed change for Black and Brown students, as well as students with disabilities. The community rose up and elected board members who would have the priorities of the over 80% students of color instead of only the 20%. There's a disconnect within the leadership on race and class and the impact of the achievement and discipline disparities that's created by out-of-touch white leaders. Gwinnett elected its first school board member in 2018, but one isn't enough to be effective. The white backlash started immediately. But white society is more sophisticated now. So Gwinnett whites launched a modern version of the racial terror that people of color have endured for centuries. The crime this time? For breaking the rule of one. Only one Black school board member allowed, the mark of entrenched white power. The Gwinnett white establishment launched an accreditation and bond rating campaign to discredit the election of Dr. Therese and Karen Watkins to the Gwinnett School Board. They claim that their election will cause Gwinnett schools to lose accreditation. The attacks against Dr. Therese and Karen Watkins, one Black and one biracial female, have everything to do with their race and them representing traditionally marginalized communities in the Gwinnett County schools. For decades, the district failed students who are not white in affluence. GCPS has not provided world-class education for low-income students, Black students, students with disabilities, and students who speak English who do not speak English as their first language. The timing of these attacks is damning. Less than 1 month after Dr. Therese and Mrs. Watkins joined the board in January 2021, this year, the GCPS establishment launched campaigns to discredit them personally and professionally. This sounds familiar. Let's look at what Louise said for a moment. First, she admitted they need to change. And second, this is the definition of insanity. The previous group had been there since God was a child. We had to do something different so that we could achieve a different result. But Louise is right. We need more change, which is why we called for the termination of Superintendent Wilbank's contract. The majority Gwinnett community needed control of our own agency. As you see, Gwinnett SToPP joined a community campaign to oust Wilbanks. Trolls descended upon Gwinnett SToPP's Facebook page. people who follow QAnon, Newsmax, and the other guy. They initially found us because we called for police-free schools, but now we publicly wanted their white messiah gone. We launched a petition, and there was more white backlash because the majority community no longer wanted to be South Africa. Black and brown people were taking agency over their lives and their children and families' lives. Can you see the word that's circled there? Let me make it bigger. Let's be clear. This is about race. When we fight for our needs, this is what we get. The opposition started a petition too, but no one wrote cracker on theirs. The minority opposition's petition received twice as many signatures as ours, but the important people were on ours. Can we talk about power? And of course, more articles decrying experience and knowledge and keeping the white messiah arose. The white minority did get their special review of Gwinnett School's accreditation. The school system is now being reviewed for congeniality of the board members, and disparate discipline and achievement was thrown in to make the complaint look legit. This has Alvin's grubby paw prints all over this campaign. The people who are the face of this campaign have no idea on how to access these levers of power, but James Alvin Wilbanks does. These people said when they came out of the woodwork in August that this is our first board meeting. You think they knew about accreditation and how to access that and whether the governor could remove school board members? Heck no, Alvin helped them. Gwinnett is still separate and unequal. Significant resources are provided for wealthy white and upper middle class or the lucky ones. Gwinnett County Schools has a 20% gap in the graduation rate of one of the most well-funded schools versus one of the least funded schools. With less funding, there are more steps. Low-income students of color there are more steps low-income students of color must take in order to matriculate to higher education, so more resources to support them is needed. We need culturally relevant curriculum. Most of the history provided today isn't taught in many schools in this country, let alone Gwinnett, which perpetuates the notion of white superiority. You cannot appropriately address a problem if you ignore it or misrepresent it. A racial problem can't be addressed with a race-neutral solution. The Census Bureau projects that U.S. population will increase by about 24% by 2060. Adults and their children who are not white will likely account for most of that growth. That multicultural future has already arrived for America's youngest students. White children are now a minority of Americans under the age of 17. That is also true for the Gwinnett student population. No one batted an eye about the bond rating as Superintendent Wilbanks used precious school system money to fund 2 positions at the Chamber of Commerce, nor when he paid twice as much for a lease purchase arrangement for the administration building that was billed as a cost savings for taxpayers. To those who attacked Dr. Therese and Mrs. Watkins, but were silent during the superintendent's many failures in leadership and moral judgment, we see you and we know what you are doing. The community benefits most when all boats rise. These systemic expressions of white supremacy only further divide us. People of color are now the majority in this country. It is our table. We are setting it. But we do invite you to join us. We got integrated schools, but now what? More than 3/4 of Gwinnett County's 180,000 students are now Black, Hispanic, Asian, or multiracial. Until 2018, however, the local school board was entirely white. I am here to affirm that Black, Indigenous people of color are the dominant culture now, and we will not only sit at the table, we will set this table, but we do invite you to join us. I mentioned Red Summer earlier. In July 1919, white mobs incited by the media attacked the Black community in Washington, D.C., and Black soldiers returning from World War I. This was one of the many violent events during Red Summer, but it is distinguished by the strong and organized Black resistance to the white violence. Black people heavily armed themselves and stood at the ready for the white backlash. That's what we have to do now. We have to be armed with the knowledge that this country was literally built on our backs, that no one is giving us anything. Then walk in the power of pushing back and demanding what we are owed for our children and our communities. Let's close with some more wisdom from our sister Kimberly.
And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Kimberly said that well. So, of course, this is how you contact us. But I'd like to bring Kwame Edwards in for a discussion and some enlightenment around the things that were introduced during this presentation. If you can expound on anything or talk about anything that resonates with you.
It all resonates with me in the consideration that, Gwinnett is a microcosm of the aggregate society that we exist within. And you can see in certain gestures that have recently transpired, i.e. the Senate enacting several symbolic measurements without actually enacting legitimate ones that people have been advocating for. And realistically, white backlash, let's call it what it is. It is anything that challenges the status quo of power for white men. And white women will acquiesce to the power of white men simply because they feel as though white men will inherently always protect them because they are the hand that rocked the cradle. Holistically, in these United States and beyond that, you have, a group of people who have originated themselves and centered themselves in imperialistic practices where they come in, remove any resources that are necessary. And then for Black people, as Kimberly Jones so put it, we were brought here as the economic laborers. We were brought here to be subservient. And the fact that we have the audacity to demand not only equality, but also equitable treatment under the law as it is written in the Constitution, ironically, that they wrote, it's funny how these things have then been, how they then say, but wait, there's an understood asterisk, right? Like all power structures in this country have those unwritten rules, right?
Absolutely.
Those ways in which you move, the societal decorums and those things, right? Their favorite pastime, right, is baseball, which has all these unwritten rules, which is why I could never get into it. I myself am a hobbyist as it relates to biking, and cycling has so many unwritten rules. Why? Because it's a sport that caters to white men, and then everyone else who doesn't fit that certain mold is then treated as a deviant and therefore ignored or overlooked. And that's just kind of the continuum pattern. If you don't have a usefulness in a place of subservience, then how dare you, and you must be eliminated. You're treated as a threat, and they will do anything to change the rules to fit them in that current time, as they did, as you saw with Gwinnett School Board, as you saw when they said, okay, integrate. Nah, we'll just shut down. Ain't no public schools,
Right.
right?
Right. But they were still taking our money.
Exactly. Still taking tax dollars, still taking, funds from other services. I'm sure, even as you look within other school systems with the charter school movement, right? They've completely defunded public schools and then pour those funds into charter schools, which then they get to control who gets in, how, who gets access to basic things. They call them public schools, right? But realistically, they're not public schools because you still have to apply to them and your entry can be denied. But the only thing public about them is their funding source.
We have spent a whole day on the charter myth.
I mean, and I only bring that up to just point out the fact that, it won't surprise me if the Georgia Board of Education, does certain things like starts minimizing the funding that gets poured into Gwinnett County schools because the county in itself demographics are changing. It won't surprise me, right, if the $4.2 trillion that Georgia Department of Education has gotten to reimagine schools, reimagines them in a way where whiteness is still centered and everyone else is still excluded. I mean, and let's not also remember that this white backlash is not just white backlash towards people of color, but it's also white backlash towards anyone who is viewed as economically inviolable. So rural communities also suffer.
Right.
White
Absolutely.
But what happens is the narrative that is carried to these white rural communities is, hey, look at us. You and me, we skin folk, which means we kinfolk. So we're looking out for you. But realistically, they're not. Somebody hit me with a proverb the other day, and I call it proverb because it makes the absolute most sense. Replace the word economy when you hear politicians speaking with rich people's yacht money, and everything will start to make sense to you. So, stimulus checks are bad for white people's or rich people's yacht money, right? Why? Because then people, in the pandemic, people recognized that it was almost more advantageous and less hazardous to their health to reinvent themselves, learn new skills, advance themselves, i.e. not enter into the repetitive rudimentary system of capitalism, which grinded them out as workers and allowed them to spend more time with their families, spend more time, listening to their children, looking at the actual education system that we have and recognizing once the schools went online, who was actually being harmed and helped. I mean, we all joke about, oh man, I never realized how hard it was to be a teacher. But then it's also learning to wait, these are the things that my children are being exposed to and learning and are being held responsible for understanding. I never had the opportunity to really investigate that, really sit down and understand that simply because, I was so caught up in this capitalist system that I was being ground out that all I cared about was, are you bringing home good grades? Not understanding what are grades actually measuring. They're measuring your ability to regurgitate and work, not your ability to learn and shift, not your ability to grow. And that's really what the American system has created. Education in itself almost is a farce. And, I commend organizations like Gwinnett SToPP who are not only seeking to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, but also develop more equitable means of education for our students. So when they get to the classrooms that I'm sitting in, it's not the first time they've ever heard that, hey, there's a hidden curriculum in the school system and you've been manipulated.
And the public education system was really about creating laborers and sending people into the paths they wanted them in. And so I love the replacement of rich people's yacht money as that when you start to talk about money, just keep replacing it with rich people's yacht money, rich people's tax breaks. All of that really aligns. And a lot of the things that we see are rooted in capitalism, right? And so
not just capitalism, but it's a specific type of capitalism, which is rooted in colonialism and imperialism, and we can never separate that from it. The United States of America is a settler colonial society, straight up.
Yes.
And with that brings a certain kind of, as Adam Smith termed it in On the Wealth of Nations, which is, the Keynesian economist Bible, end stage capitalism. We have proliferated and jumped 700 years into the future, but only been using the United States has been around for 250. So in 250 years, we've seen to advance what capitalist theory was supposed to look like. But even in that, it depended on the marginalization and the subjugation of other humans. And that's all we're trying to do. That's not we are trying to do, but that's all this is trying to do. So that white backlash understands that, hey, if we don't maintain where we are within the power structures, that our future generations could be caught up in the BS. So even if it's just symbolic power, right? Even if it's just, things, the trappings of, it could have harmful effects. I mean, and again, Black people and other peoples of color in aggregate aren't seeking to dominate and to subjugate. They're just seeking an equitable opportunity. They're seeking equitable education. They're seeking an understanding of self, which has been systemically robbed from them, i.e., when you look at
we were raped of our language, our culture, all of that.
Exactly. Why Black history is only, taught in very sparse moments. And when it is taught, you get the same 7 stories. And it's not just true in this country. It's also true in the United Kingdom. It's also true in France. It's also, but think about it. It's true in all of these nations in which they say this is where my culture and society comes from, i.e. colonial nations. Argentina literally eliminated their entire indigenous population.
Yes.
So when you go to Argentina, in Latin America, it is literally referred to as the nation of Blanquitos, which makes absolutely no sense when you consider that most of their population should be indigenous, considering where it physically sits. You look at Chile, ethnic cleansing occurred there too, and that's why now there's backlash and revolution occurring. You look at a place like Colombia, look at Venezuela. All of these nations are demonstrating what happens when people of color come together and push back and say, no mas, no more. And the United States sees the writing on the wall. I mean,
absolutely.
They
do understand that the white folks will be the minority in this nation. And so, and as that's happening, people of color are demanding an equitable opportunity, demanding a seat at the table, setting tables, and
building our own tables,
building our own tables.
Which we've already been doing, you know what I mean?
We've been doing that all along. We've been doing that all along. But now when there's really that scare that's being put out from a national level, national political parties are really rallying around this whole culture war and turning up the heat and the volume on that, which drives, again, more racism, more of the white backlash, keeps all of that going. The Georgia Department of Education just recently, the Georgia State School Board just recently passed a resolution to teach, they said to teach the truth. They didn't use the words critical race theory. They said they were very careful not to use that. However, a lot of the language in that resolution is pulled from a guidebook by the architect of this national movement to push back on CRT, critical race theory. And so, when you think about that, they were very careful not to mention critical race theory. Well, their icon told them, don't do that. Don't say those words. Instead, frame it this way. But really, when you read his guidebook, it will fully unpack what all the language you're hearing, the messaging you're hearing, it is that. He tells you how to do it. He gives you sample legislation that's passed around the country, and all that does is stoke white fears, which gets you white backlash, and people of color have known this for years. That is the result of that, of stoking it. And what happens when you get it too far and you can't pull it back and you can't control it? That's what happened with the Republicans and the Tea Party. They created the Tea Party and then they couldn't control them. And then the Tea Party started to eat them.
Yes.
And so now we're at Tea Party, 3.0?
Yeah.
And they can't control them either.
It's Bacon's Rebellion all over again. I mean, history repeats itself. And the saddest part about it is that when you have been socialized through the American school system, you'll learn about Bacon's Rebellion, but you learn about it as a fact and not as a context for informing what happens when you take advantage first of a group of marginalized people. In this case, it was poor white people. You empower them, teach them to fight, but again, fight for your cause, and then you continue to leave them marginalized. Well, now they've been radicalized and recognized that, hey, I'm not just going to fight your battles, I'm also going to fight my own battles. The difference is Bacon's Rebellion was put down by George Washington and, the U.S., a militia group, a trained militia group, because we didn't have a formalized military back then.
Right.
And the Tea Party, they're taken down by policies at the end of the day, right? Like, they have not mobilized themselves enough to understand that they have to fight in places on paper, that they do not control law enforcement agencies, so on and so forth, right? The storming of the Capitol, or people refer to it as an insurrection. I personally just thought of it as, oh, look, Bacon's Rebellion again. The difference was somehow they had the dog whistle where they blew it and the people just ran out of steam, right? They took over the building and then had no demands. And that's what happens when you have an unorganized militia, when you have an unorganized group that is fighting, but they don't really know what they're fighting for. They've been galvanized by effectively a group of people who are going to leave them swinging in the wind. And now those people are facing charges and saying, I can't believe I was tricked and deceived and all this. And,
right. And there was
color looking at him like, yeah, duh.
and that's why they feared Martin Luther King so much. They love him now that he's dead, though, right?
And they fear around his words,
right? He was such a radical. And he really had a dream of radical liberation, but it was for all people. And he kept talking about that whole poor people coming together and poor people's march, and understanding that poor whites are at the same place as poor blacks, as poor Asians, poor Latinx. Y'all all in the same boat. You need to band together and fight for that. Fight for, your equitable opportunity across the board. Throw that race stuff out and fight for that. And he was a danger. He was absolutely a danger. He was a threat and a danger, because if you mobilize people, like you said, around a cause, a just cause, they will win. They will win. And when they throw out your narratives that you're putting on them to carry your messaging, they will win.
Indeed. Yeah, so, I mean, again, back to the entire notion of white backlash, people will always, in a place where people have been socialized to prioritize the individual, they will always prioritize individual power first over collective good. And realistically, an equitable society is collectively good, because it does actually provoke and warrant a meritocracy. Now, obviously, that is not 100% infallible, right? Like, there are still going to be some people who get ahead because of, the notions of who you know versus what you have worked for. But in aggregate, if you work more towards an equitable society, then you work more towards a meritocracy, which then also behooves people to have an education that teaches them not a nationalistic pride, but a real truth in what goes on in the world and the inner workings and mechanisms as it relates to functional societies. People have issues with the way many societies teach their own histories. And let's be honest, history classes in general are not for sociological understandings, not for intersectional understandings, but they are for nationalistic pride purposes, unless you happen to grow up in a place like Germany, where they've met the resolve that says, never again will this occur. You go to a place like South Africa, and from what I've heard, again, the atrocities of the apartheid regime have been put on display within the education system. I've never taught in South Africa, and I've only done some reading, and that's what it sounds like happens. But for the aggregate, the United States, I've taught U.S. history, I've read the curriculum books, I've taught AP history. I understand that not in one place has a U.S. history book ever painted Americans as they truly are, which is first, isolationists, secondly, bullies, thirdly, profiteers of war. And until we start teaching those three things accurately, and a lot of those things overlap, so don't think it happened in discriminate stages. And that's another thing. We teach history as facts in this country versus understanding that these are intersectional occurrences that have led to where we're at currently and led to the actions that went down. When we teach about the man who's on the $20 bill instead of the woman who should be on the $20 bill, who's approved to be on the $20 bill, and I'm talking about Andrew Jackson over Harriet Tubman, we talk about Andrew Jackson as this champion of the everyman, when in actuality, Andrew Jackson was a bully, an isolationist bully who actually demonstrated way before Donald Trump, that the Constitution is
right. And that's what I was going to bring up when you mentioned him.
Exactly. Is that
he was the original Trump.
Exactly. He said, okay, cool. If you want to enforce the Constitution, enforce it, Supreme Court. I dare you. Bring your army and I will hear them out. Oh, wait, what's that? You don't have an army. Looks like I'll do what I want. So, and he did what he wanted. And you look at then the administrations that followed him under Van Buren, that's when the Indian removal, he signed the Indian Removal Act, but it was actually carried out under Martin Van Buren. If you look, and that's again, we talk about things like the Carlisle School and the Hampton School, these things that, again, save the man, dissolve the Indian, or whatever they said.
Right.
Those types of things. When you look at American, integration or immigration policies, and we talk about how it's fair and anyone can be an American. No, because we literally have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that encompassed not only Chinese people, but anyone who was coming from Asia. But yet, the whole thing with the Statue of Liberty, and I guess it must be because she was facing towards Europe. Yes, give me your tired, your poor, and your huddled masses. Only if they come through.
But when they came,
only if they're coming from Europe.
Right. If they come from Europe, and then even when they were coming from Europe, there was the marginalization that was done of the Irish and the Italians.
Well, that was because they were viewed as low skilled. They were
absolutely so
subjugated people. So again, we'll subjugate those people into certain positions, which then keeps them as the buffer between us, who are the descendants of certain people, and then those people of color who we completely never want to rise above a certain social stature. So it's, the Joyner
and the education system is the way to reinforce it.
Exactly.
The education system.
Let's be honest, they never opened up schools to educate everyone. Schools have been open incrementally to educate certain people to do certain things and to educate other people into doing other things. That's why you look at a place like Harvard, demographics have largely largely remain unchanged. Harvard is older than the United States, and yet has rarely in itself integrated. But then if you look at the United States Senate, rarely integrated. The United States House of Representatives, a bit more integrated, but still not really. You look at the presidency. Let's see. We've had one person of color occupy the office of president. We've had one person of color occupy the office of vice president, unless you count the very first president of the Continental Congress, which again was a person of African descent. But again, and even when Alexander Hamilton, the man on the $10 bill, challenged a white man in public, guess what? He got shot. So again, and he was a person of color. So this whole white backlash will continue to occur until white people have conversations with other white people and really start checking them on their power, privilege, and their stature in society. Do you really deserve to be on top simply because you happen to be the descendant of certain people who really didn't earn their place here? They were given a place here.
Right.
And again, you're here as a settler colonist. That's why the United States regime is propping up the Israeli regime, because again, settler colonialist nation.
Absolutely.
Why our allies are Canada, the United Kingdom, or Canada and Australia and New Zealand, settler colonialist nations.
Well, we could keep this discussion going on forever, but we do have a time frame to operate within. I so appreciate Kwame Edwards for being here and enlightening us further on white backlash, our history, and just how important it is to bring all the folks together and work on behalf of that equitable opportunity. And so thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed the program. Give us a like if you did, and if you didn't, oh well. This is how you contact us. You can visit our website, follow us at Gwinnett SToPP, or you can shoot us an email, info@gwinnettstop.org. I hope you enjoyed the program, and with that, we will close. Thank you again, Professor Edwards, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.